Good evening, everybody. This is Dr. Jessica Freedman from MedEdit's Medical Admissions. If you could just all let me know you're here, we'll wait a little bit for people to arrive, and then we will go ahead and jump right in. It does always take a little bit of time for everyone to get here. Just make sure that we are ready to go. Okay, and we'll start in just a minute. Okay, so I think we are all set, and I'm happy. Hi, Tatiana. Nice to see you again tonight. I'm happy you're here. It is great to be here again tonight, and it's certainly an exciting time in the season for medical school admissions, college admissions, residency, everything. We're really in the swing in terms of students interviewing, getting interviews, going on interviews. And really, it's just a time when we start sort of hearing some great results from our students in terms of acceptances, continued interviews, and we're super proud of how everyone is doing on our end. So just for those who are just arriving, I always like to introduce myself at the start of these sessions, especially for members of our audience who are new, who haven't been here before. My name is Dr. Jessica Freedman. I am the chair and founder of MedEdit's Medical Admissions. I am a physician. I was on the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai faculty. I left there to start MedEdits about 15 plus years ago at this point. And I have been involved in medical education and medical admissions for literally my entire career, starting when I myself was a medical student. So we have the great luxury of not only understanding what's going on today in the world of medical education and medical admissions, but I also, and my team, we have a great understanding of the history of how everything has evolved, and we understand the trends, how those trends have changed in medical education, and how that impacts medical school admissions. And certainly there have been a lot of changes over the past several years. You may be reading about some of that in the news and how that relates to college admissions. Whatever's going on in the world of college admissions in terms of overall trends is reflected in medical school admissions as well. So that means that medical school admissions committees are paying more attention to experiences related to social justice, inequities related to medicine or otherwise. And so the priorities have shifted a bit, I'd say, over the past several years. And we definitely see that more every year. So I am going to go ahead. For those of you who don't know, I do ask for questions on the day of these lives. I ask people to post their questions in our private Facebook group, and then I launch the sessions by answering those questions. So if you are not a member of our Facebook group, I encourage you to join our Facebook group, because then you do have the opportunity to post those questions in advance, and then that way I can answer those questions when we do go live. So let me go ahead and let me find the questions that we have. And hold on 1 minute. I'm having a hard time finding them for some reason. So someone had asked if there was a difference in residency placement for MD versus DO, osteopathic residency outcomes. And if it's more difficult for students to get residencies if they are graduating from an osteopathic medical school. So like everything else, there isn't sort of a clear yes, no sort of answer to all of this. But generally speaking, osteopathic medical school graduates, so those students who are earning a DO rather than an MD, it is going to be a bit more competitive for them to get to get residencies in the most competitive specialties in medicine. So some of the most competitive specialties, this is not a comprehensive list, but things like dermatology, ophthalmology, plastic surgery, those positions are going to definitely be tougher if you are graduating from an osteopathic medical school. There also are going to be some programs even within every specialty in medicine that are going to be reserved and are going to be sort of more MD or allopathic friendly that might not be attainable as an osteopathic medical school graduate. I always explain to everyone nothing is impossible. There is always a first time for everything. There is a different strategy when you are trying to match into your residency program of choice, very different than the medical school admission strategy, very different from the college admission strategy. But certainly having an MD, graduating from an MD school, an allopathic medical school, is definitely going to give you different options. Let me put it that way. I wouldn't say better, I wouldn't say worse, different. So I hope that answers your question. Someone had asked me specifically about LECOM. LECOM is a fantastic osteopathic medical school. We have had students who have gone there who have been very, very happy. Absolutely. Okay, once a student gets the interview invitation, then his selection is completely dependent on interview performance, or do they still look at his MCAT GPA score and research work? Please clarify. So Mohan, this is a great question. Once you go in for a medical school interview, certainly the interview becomes the most important ingredient in the medical school admissions process. That said, your application is still going to be reviewed, potentially by your interviewer, potentially by other members of the medical school admissions committee. So it's not as if once you interview, everything else is just kind of erased and is no longer considered. All of those elements of your candidacy, of your application, are still going to be just as important after you interview as they were before you interviewed. You certainly, those are the things that are going to earn you an interview, unquestionably. But those things are still going to be considered even after you have interviewed, most definitely. Somebody asks, Siva asks, my daughter wants to pursue an MD MBA. Do they need to apply for this program and do focus on ECs during college level? She does activities during high school. I think I'm understanding this correctly. If you want to pursue an MD MBA and you want to apply to a joint program, and there are not a ton of medical schools offer this option, but I would encourage you, you're basically applying to two different schools. You're applying to two different pathways. It's the same thing as MD PhD. When you're applying for an MD PhD, you have to be competitive for medical school. You have to also simultaneously be competitive for the PhD program. So when you're applying for an MD MBA, it's the same thing. You need to be competitive to the MDs and you need to be competitive to the MBAs. So this is why these dual admissions processes are more difficult, because you're applying to two very distinctive programs that have very, very distinctive criteria that they're looking for in applicants. Selena asks, my daughter has received 5 interview invitations for MD schools, but there haven't been any more interviews in the last couple of weeks. Is there still a chance she might receive more interview offers? Also, what's the typical waiting time after an interview to hear back from school? So let me kind of answer this piece by piece. At this point in the cycle, the interviews start to trickle. At the beginning of the cycle, so we're talking September, October, the interviews tend to kind of come all at once. Then the process starts to slow down a little bit as the medical schools are interviewing applicants. They're simultaneously still reviewing applications. So interview invitations start to trickle. our students, we see interview invitations get extended literally until February, March. And so there's still plenty of time. They just might not come in the same, at the same sort of rate as they came at the beginning. Every medical school extends their acceptances. They have a different timeline. There are some medical schools that, let's say, their committee meets every week. Maybe their committee meets every couple of weeks. Maybe the individual who reviewed your daughter wasn't at the most recent committee meeting. So there are many different factors that can influence when that ultimate decision is going to be released. It varies anywhere from, I'd say, 3 weeks up until several months, because there are a whole group of medical schools that only release all of their acceptances at once in March. So there's huge variation. It is perfectly fine if, let's say, when you interview for a medical school and they say, oh, you're going to hear from us in about 6 weeks, and you hit the 6-week mark and you still haven't heard from them, it's perfectly fine to call that medical school and ask them very politely and respectfully, I was told I was going to hear in 6 weeks. I haven't heard anything. Do you, know what the approximate time frame might be? Perfectly fine to do that. Most medical schools, after you interview, are going to give you an estimate of when they expect you will hear back from them. Is it possible to, Selena asks, is it possible to contact schools if you haven't received an interview to inquire about the status? Absolutely. You can call a medical school to inquire about your status. That's probably going to be the best way to get that information. And the phone call is something like, hello, my name is, Susie Smith, and I applied to your medical school and I haven't, heard anything. And I was just wondering if you could give me any information about the status of my application. And they may not be able to offer you any information. But again, as long as you call, you're respectful, you're kind, you're treating the other person, the other person on the other end of the phone as a human being, it's perfectly fine to call about the status of your application. They may not be able to give you any information, but it's perfectly okay to ask that. Okay, let me see. Sangeeta asks, I wanted to know if there are any changes in the 2024 accreditation. I'm not sure what that you're asking exactly. If there's a specific medical school you're questioning, if there's an accreditation issue with a specific medical school, I would encourage you to look at the medical school's website, or to look at the medical school accreditation website to see if there are any issues. Okay, so let's now start with our live questions here. Okay, I heard that once students get an interview inviting them, then final decision depends on interview performance. After that, MCAT and GPA don't matter. Is this correct? So I answered this question earlier. So if you weren't here for the at the beginning, and if you didn't hear my response, I encourage you to go back and listen to to the recording when it's posted. But once you get an interview, the interview performance is certainly the most important factor in the decision of what your ultimate outcome is going to be, whether that's an acceptance, whether that's a wait list, or whether that's a denial. But all aspects of your candidacy, your MCAT, your GPA, your experiences, your letters of recommendation, your transcript, all the different ingredients of your candidacy, of your application, still are going to be reviewed potentially by your interviewer, potentially by other members of the medical school admissions committee. So absolutely, those things still do come into play. Okay. Nate asks, is it better to attend a DO school in the United States or an MD school in the Caribbean? Fantastic question. If you had asked me this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have advised you that the two were equal. Caribbean medical students, I'd say again, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago even, were not having such a difficult time getting residencies in the United States. Over the past several years, Caribbean medical education, Caribbean medical schools accept many applicants. They have different start times, Not all of those applicants are successful. Not all those applicants are able to pass the USMLE Step 1 licensing exam, which allows them to move on to clinical rotations. And the clinical rotation sites for a lot of the Caribbean medical schools are all over the country. So these students, not only do they have the challenge of living, in what is for many people described as sort of a third world country for their first 2 years of medical school, but then they're traveling, they're bouncing around for all of their rotations once they're doing their clinical rotations here in the US. And we are also finding that many Caribbean medical school graduates who are considered US international medical graduates based on the residency data that is published, they don't, their match rates are not actually as high as osteopathic medical school graduates. So our general recommendation at this point for our students is to potentially go to an osteopathic school over a Caribbean medical school. But of course, when we're making these recommendations, we are considering what the students' goals are. We are considering what type of individual they are, how much challenge can they handle. For some students going to the Caribbean, they see that as a tremendous challenge and they really embrace that. And they love that idea of living in another country, of traveling around for their rotations. And they like that kind of more nomadic lifestyle. So it also depends on what the students' goals are, who they are personally. There also are some people who really would much rather earn an MD than a DO. They don't want to have a DO after their name. As a practicing, as someone who's practiced in many different clinical settings, academic, urban, suburban, community, I can tell you that MDs and DOs, we all work alongside one another. There is no difference in how we practice. And, in all of those different settings, we were equals. And patients don't, look at the initials next to your name and think like, oh, I don't want you to touch me. So I don't think there is this stigma that many applicants and many applicants' parents think there is when it comes to osteopathic, an osteopathic degree. Okay. All right, this is a great question. Okay, Farida asks, at what point during the application cycle should my child think about starting to prepare for the next application cycle in case she does not get an acceptance? My daughter submitted all of her applications in mid-August to the first half of September and has a decent scores and an MCAT of 515. So Farida, first of all, an MCAT of 515 is fantastic. And I would expect that with that MCAT, assuming that everything else is in place, that your daughter is certainly a competitive applicant for US allopathic medical schools, as well as for US osteopathic medical schools. Osteopathic medical schools are only in the US. Let me just clarify that. I would say if there's a reason she hasn't gotten interviews at this point, it's because she submitted her application most definitely on the late side. So when we have applicants who call us and they want to work with us in submitting an application in August, our advice is to them is always wait until next cycle, because we think that you are more likely to get better results submitting early next cycle than to be submitting in mid-August. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be successful if you submit in mid-August. We certainly have worked with applicants who have risked it and who have applied in mid-August. They definitely will be getting later interviews because they submitted later. So if your daughter submitted in mid-August, then in the first half of September, probably most medical schools are sort of just getting around to actually reviewing her application. So I would say our general timeline is if by the new year, so if by January 2024, you don't yet have any interviews, that is definitely a time to start reevaluating the candidacy, really looking at the application, figuring out what needs to be done better if there needs to be a reapplication, and sort of starting to think about that process, thinking about, okay, what am I going to be doing during the gap year if I have to reapply in 2024? What am I going to be doing? Starting to look for those opportunities depending on what the gaps are in your experience or where potentially you can build upon your experiences. So I'd say January 2024 is when we would want to hear from you to start thinking about a reapplication. Every year we work with students on reapplications who then get accepted. So, there are a lot of things that can happen over the course, from January until, literally June of the application year. Hello, Camille from California. It's so good to see you. I hope everything's well on your end. All right. Okay, so this is a great question too. So Julie asks, what is the last date? I think you mean date. My daughter would take the MCAT to take one gap year. So the latest date that we recommend taking the MCAT if you're taking a gap year is in June of the year that you are applying. I say this with a caveat that means you will be submitting an application to medical school without knowing what your MCAT score is. There are some students who are uncomfortable with this because you're submitting your application to allopathic medical schools at the end of May. You're submitting your application to osteopathic medical schools at the beginning of May. And so there are some students who are going to be uncomfortable submitting those applications without knowing what their MCAT score is. So if you're comfortable submitting an application without having that data point, then we recommend that the latest date is any date in June. Okay. If you are more comfortable submitting an application and knowing your MCAT score, then the latest date that we would recommend taking the MCAT is sometime in April. That way, at least you are submitting an application, even if you're getting it back, very right before you actually submit. But at least you're submitting knowing what your MCAT score is. We can always, once we see an MCAT score that comes back after you submit an application, we can always go back and add on schools to the school list depending on that MCAT result. And we do that quite often with students. Okay, here's another good question. What advice would you give an M1 student in terms of residency and matching? So an M1 student, for those of you who don't know the terminology, is a first-year medical student. So the advice that I'd give a first-year medical student, first of all, is to keep exploring specialties. For fourth year, the beginning of fourth year comes around very, very quickly. And sometime during your third year, in order to be best prepared to be the most competitive residency applicant, you need to know what specialty you're pursuing by the middle to like 2/3 the way through your third year. So if a student is pursuing a very, very competitive specialty, they really need to show expertise in that specialty, which is why when students start medical school, they often don't know what specialty they want to pursue. They think to themselves, well, I'm going to explore all the specialties my third year once I get into the hospital. Third year, you're only rotating through core specialties. Many medical schools have no elective opportunities at that time. They usually come later in the fourth year of medical school. And also for really competitive specialties, they want to see demonstrated interest in that specialty. So while everyone tells you to enter medical school with an open mind, at the same time, I mean, that sort of is in the ideal world. You should enter with a completely open mind. But the reality is that if you are applying for a really competitive specialty, that the residency admissions committees are going to want to see demonstrated interest in that specialty. So this is why we explain to students, be sure you are getting exposure to as many specialties as possible early on in medical school. And then once you have identified the specialty that you're most interested in, or the specialties that you're most interested in, you join those interest groups. You potentially try to get research experience in those specialties. You want to be doing some type of community service early in medical school. This is something you probably won't have time to continue once you are a third and a fourth year medical student, but certainly in your first and second years of medical school, you want to be be doing some level of community service. That can be clinically related. Almost all medical schools at this point have free clinics. This is a great way to learn about clinical medicine while helping underserved populations. So you don't only want to be studying, in other words. You don't need to have as many experiences as you had as a pre-med. You simply aren't going to have the time to do that, and you're not expected to have that level of involvement when you are applying to residency. But you also want to demonstrate that you're not just studying all the time, even though you certainly could do that. there certainly is enough material in your first 2 years of medical school that you could do nothing but study, and you wouldn't run out of time. Okay. How competitive is Washington School of Medicine? So WashU, Washington University in St. Louis. WashU in St. Louis is one of the top medical schools in the country. And it is a very, very competitive medical school. And our top students are the students who are getting interviews and getting acceptances at WashU. So it's a fantastic medical school. So Julie asks, can you withdraw your applications? Absolutely, you can withdraw your applications. And, and sometimes when we have a student, the situation we were talking about earlier, where maybe they were waiting for an MCAT score and they submitted an application without knowing that MCAT score, we get that MCAT score back. It is not a competitive MCAT score. They decide that they're going to, regroup and reapply, retake the MCAT. The student will then withdraw their application, certainly, and reapply the following year. So Parul asks, is the summer before junior year a good time to prep for the MCAT? Absolutely. Actually, the summer before junior year, I would say the minority of students are prepping for the MCAT because most students are still taking some prerequisites in junior year, and most of them are also taking gap years. For the student who does not want to take a gap year and who has all their prerequisites by the end of sophomore year, absolutely the summer before junior year is the time to get started. I can tell you, having worked with a lot of different students, sometimes, and I think potentially it's because the students aren't as mature when they're sophomores, or they feel that they're more, they're more in a rush because they aren't taking a gap year. They're applying at the end of their junior year of college. I do find that sometimes students in that position take the MCAT at the beginning of their junior year when maybe they aren't the best prepared, and then they end up having to retake. So no matter when you take the MCAT, you only want to take it when you are the absolutely most prepared to do the best on the exam as you possibly can. Certainly a retake is not held against students. Many students have to retake the MCAT, but it is a huge undertaking to take the MCAT. It's not like taking the SAT or the ACT where you can just sit for the test, without really preparing. If you just sort of feel like, I'm having a good day today, I want to go take the test, maybe I'll bump my score. It's not that kind of test. Every time you sit for the MCAT requires a minimum of 3 months of preparation, which is why we really encourage our students to only go in and take the MCAT when they are absolutely the best prepared possible. Okay, good questions tonight. Do you know of, or can you predict any changes that will significantly impact medical school admissions in the next 4 years? This is a great question, Nate. I'm not anticipating anything significant. There is like a bill that's been proposed about ending legacy admissions, but I can tell you that that is not a thing in medical school admissions in the way it is for colleges. So I think that if that passes, I think that's something that's only going to change in the college admissions process, not in the medical school admissions process. I don't think that the affirmative action ruling really is going to change much. I still think medical schools are considering people's identities and backgrounds very, very carefully when they are putting together classes. And, in medical school admissions is also a bit different because we actually have interviews. And so certainly, questions can be asked that can give admissions committee interviewers a sense of somebody's background. But I don't anticipate any major changes at this point. I think that there will potentially just be a continuation of the changes that we've already seen in the past several years. I think that those things will kind of remain the same. Things like really wanting students to have advocacy work, social justice work, things of that nature. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. Julie asks, can you recommend a service for MCAT prep? So MCAT prep, what we always advise our students is you want to, ask yourself, how did I prep for the SAT? How did I prep for the ACT? I realize that potentially is going to be a more, not such a clear answer for students who went test optional. I don't think I guess some of the students who are now pre-meds did go test optional, but that certainly is going to be a more difficult question to answer for those students. But most students know how they prepare best for tests. Do they do better by studying on their own? In which case, I recommend getting the MCAT books, the Kaplan MCAT books. Those seem to be the most popular when you're self-studying. Do they do better by taking a course? Because a course keeps them accountable. It keeps them organized. It keeps them on track. And it just, it really forces you to do that content review, which is so important, and it spaces out your practice testing. Most students we find take Kaplan and Princeton Review for their MCAT courses. And then, of course, there are some students who tutor the whole way through. I find that most students are doing courses or self-studying, and then if they need tutoring, they then will bring on a tutor to sort of do a little bit kind of more focused preparation in areas maybe where they're weak and where perhaps they need improvement. And we certainly have some outstanding tutors who work with our students, and we've seen amazing results with those tutors who have worked with our students. Okay. Someone asks, can you recommend interview preparation for medical school admission? We do interview preparation for medical school, whether that's a traditional interview, whether that's an MMI interview. We also have multiple faculty, and we find that it is actually very useful when our students are doing mock interviews, not just with one faculty member, but several, because this gives the student a different experience. It really is more reflective of what experience they're going to have when they are actually interviewing. And we don't sort of want them to get too comfortable with one interviewer because they're going to be meeting somebody new. So we do all types of interview prep. And so if you are interested in that, you can email us info@mededits.com. We can send you information. And how many interviews a student does, mock interviews, really depends on their level of comfort. The idea with a medical school interview is you want to just learn more about the process. You want to become comfortable with the process. You don't want to be memorizing answers. And there is a point where students potentially over-prepare. And so we don't want students over-preparing. We still want them walking into every interview fresh and energized and very authentic. That's a key to success. Julie asks, do you recommend taking biostats? There are a number of medical schools that do require math at the undergraduate level. And generally speaking, for students who are not taking calculus as an undergraduate, they're either taking stats or they're taking biostats. So biostats, if it can fit into the student's schedule, whether or not you need it for a requirement, is certainly a very, very valuable class to take. So yes, I definitely recommend that if it can fit. Okay, good questions tonight. Parul asks, my son transferred AP Chem credit from high school to university. Does that mean that he is missing general chemistry prerequisite for medical school? He is currently doing organic chemistry. So Parul, yes, we do not recommend transferring AP credit for GenCam because there are going to be many medical schools who are going to require general chemistry as one of their prerequisites. Now, not all medical schools are going to require general chemistry. There are more and more medical schools that are moving towards competency-based admissions where they are just looking for competency within a certain area. So they don't necessarily have very defined prerequisites. But until everybody moves over to that system, we are recommending that students take chemistry, that GenCam, that they don't AP out of it, that they take bio, that they don't AP out of that. The only subject that we recommend if a student wants to getting AP credit for in college is going to be AP calculus. If you want to see the medical school's requirements, you can either go to their website or you can get a subscription to the MSAR, the Medical School Admissions Requirements, that's published every year by the AAMC. That is going to have the most up-to-date information with regards to what prerequisites every medical school is going to require. Every once in a while, we'll have a student that we haven't worked with before, and they come to us in their application year working with us, and we see they don't have GenCam. And if they end up at a medical school that requires GenCam, or if they're applying to schools that require GenCam, they can call those schools and make sure that it is absolutely required. And as long as you take that requirement before you actually matriculate, then you're okay. But the issue with GenCam is that there's also a lab with it as well. So it's a fairly time-intensive commitment. And the other thing that I'd recommend, Parul, that your son do is that he speak with his pre-med advisor at his undergraduate college, because it's possible that the college has dealt with this before and that they might have a special way of navigating this for their students. So for example, Tufts, for example, only has one semester of organic. It's combined with biochem. But that's a unique thing for Tufts. So when applicants are applying out of Tufts, the medical schools know that. It's in all their communication. So just make sure that the pre-med advisor doesn't have any specific recommendations or advice for your student. And we, as a general rule, just as sort of a sidebar, we do recommend that all students, if you have pre-med advising at your undergraduate college, it's really important that you meet with your pre-med advisor, not only because you want them on your side and because if there's a committee letter, you do want a committee letter, but also because there are going to be dates and deadlines that you have to meet. There potentially are going to be course requirements that are unique to your college. And so, you always want to stay on your pre-med advisor's good side. You want to meet with them. Some pre-med advisors are fantastic and they guide students really well. Others are, very young. They may not have a lot of experience. They may not be as good, but you still want to meet with them and you still want to, have them invested in your success. Okay, Nate asks, how exactly does matching into residency work? Oh, Nate, it's a very complicated process. Maybe I would need a lot of time to explain it, but so how exactly does matching into residency work? Is it acceptances that you choose to match with, or is it sort of a final decision once a hospital matches you? So Nate, it's more the latter. So when you are applying for residency, and residency has changed recently over the past couple of years, in that students, it used to be, would just, apply to all the programs they were interested in, and they would see what interviews they received. Now students are required to do something called signal programs to indicate if they're specifically interested in those programs. And there's different levels of signaling. And every specialty has their own number of signals. And for many specialties, it's sort of an unspoken rule that if you don't signal a program, you're not getting an interview. Once you're interviewed, you then rank the programs rank you. There's an algorithm that matches you with your program. And on a day in March, you find out where you're doing your residency. So this is one of the reasons why we also say to our applicants, please don't interview anywhere where you will be miserable going to, because inevitably that's where you're going to match. So it's very, very different than the medical school admissions process. It's not like you apply and get acceptances. And it's also a little bit tricky, in my opinion, because now that everyone has switched to virtual interviews, in my opinion, it was very important to go to those residency programs and to really be on site. I mean, they were at least half day. We used to have, I'd say, 5-hour residency interview days where, they got a tour, we had lunch, they met our residents. And I think that was a really important part of the process, because you don't get to tour a residency program before you match there now. And I think that's detrimental to the process, honestly. Okay, Jennifer asks, do you believe medical schools practice yield? I don't think, Jennifer, that medical schools practice yield in the same way that colleges practice yield. But I do think that it does happen potentially at some schools. So, for example, let's say your student has a 521 in the MCAT, they have a 4.0 GPA, they have, 6 research publications, 3 research experiences of, 1,500 hours each. And they're clearly just someone who's aiming for a top tier research focused school. That student may not get an interview at a smaller, less competitive medical school where the focus is primary care, right? Even if that's their state school, maybe. So I think that they practice yield from that standpoint. When they really see a student who is not the right fit, who's not the right match, they're potentially not offering an interview. And this is why students are sometimes very surprised. My numbers are so much better than the averages at that medical school. Why didn't I get an interview? And it's not really yield as much as it is sort of a match with the student. Okay. Salma asks, is it harder to get a residency after MD school in the Caribbean or a DO school? Yeah. So Salma, I encourage you to watch the recording because we discussed Caribbean versus osteopathic medical schools earlier, closer to the 8 o'clock hour. It is definitely harder to get a residency if you are graduating from either an osteopathic medical school or a Caribbean medical school. You are going to be somewhat limited, or you're not going to have as much access to certain specialties in medicine, and you're not going to have as much access to some of the most competitive programs in the country in any specialty in medicine. That includes internal medicine, family medicine, pediatrics, which are generally considered less competitive. So certainly it's going to be more difficult, but again, you have to do the right things as a medical student to prepare yourself to be the absolute strongest applicant you can be for residency. There are many students who they think, gosh, I got into medical school. That was like, I'm set now because that was really hard. I'm like, my medical school has a 6% acceptance rate, so I'm going to have no problem getting a residency. And that's not true. The next process, you basically have to start all over again with the residency admissions process as soon as you start medical school. Totally new process, completely different strategy. But yeah, it's definitely tougher if you're coming from an osteopathic school or Caribbean school to get certain specialties, to get certain programs. Okay. Jayotika asks, is 200 clinical hours and about 400 hours of research considered adequate during a gap year? So Jayotika, we always sort of answer these questions. It depends on what your goals are. It depends on where you want to go. It depends on what your other experiences are as an undergraduate. I can tell you that most of our students who are doing gap years are, they typically will have one primary experience that is really their focus during that gap year. And they are gaining thousands of hours, hundreds and thousands of hours. So I would say that 200 clinical hours and 400 hours of research is something that we are seeing more typically for a student who is applying at the end of their junior year of college. And, they're doing what I now consider to be the accelerated path to medical school. But even those students have more than this. But again, it depends on what your goals are. It depends on what state you're from. It depends on your ethnicity. There's so many variables that are going to contribute to our recommendations about your experience profile. Okay. Pankaj asks, any suggestions on how to manage the wait post-interview to an offer? Do you suggest sending updates to the schools if one hasn't received an offer? So Pankaj, first of all, any school that accepts an update, you absolutely can send updates if you have something valuable to tell the medical schools. We don't want you sending an update just for the sake of just sort of saying, here I am, I love your school. You only want to send an update if you really have a valuable update, something significant that they don't already know about. And it's hard to manage the wait. I know it's hard to manage the wait. You just have to be patient. Um, there's not a lot I can say. For schools that don't accept updates, there's nothing you can do. And you don't want to break those rules, because then it makes it seem like you can't follow rules. But for schools that allow updates, for schools that are, allow letters of intent, it's still a bit early for a letter of intent. That's a letter where you expressly state, your school is my top choice and I will attend if accepted. That's something we're not looking at until, at least after the new year, however. But certainly updates are definitely valuable. We have our students sending updates when they've done something significant, even at this point in the process. But many, many students don't have valuable updates at this point. Like if they've started, let's say, a gap year experience in July or August, they're not necessarily going to have anything really significant to report this early. Okay. Julie asks, is there somewhere my daughter can read about more of the culture of each of the medical schools? Yeah, Julie, this is tough. You can look at mission statements. That's going to tell you a lot. I would say the time when you're really going to learn about the culture of the medical schools is when you go on revisits. So the medical schools, again, unlike the residency programs, which again, I think that's not a good thing for residency programs, but the medical schools are going to have revisit days for all accepted students that happen in April. So assuming your student has their acceptance by the time those April revisit days happen, that's when you're going to visit. That's when you're going to meet the students. That's when you're going to meet the leadership of the medical school. And you're going to really kind of get a feel for what the culture of the school is, what they value, what the students are like, the location, all of that. So until then, it's really just about reading. Some schools will have student blogs, student input, but all that stuff is curated. I would also discourage students from sort of going onto TikTok and, getting one person's opinion about a school, or going on Reddit or anything like that. So I'd say your most valuable information is going to come from those revisit days once you're accepted and you've kind of determined, assuming you have more than one acceptance, you're going to, kind of have to narrow down where you potentially want to go. Okay. Parul asks, do you recommend sports involvement at university? How does medical school admissions look at sports like Frisbee team, not top tier sports team? So Parul, it's always good to have involvement in something that isn't related to medicine. Is it going to help in the process? No. But does it help to sort of say, like, okay, here's a student who has other interests. They don't just go to the lab. They don't just sit in the library. They have friends who do other things. They can relate to other people. They're a member of a team. So they must be a good team player. So it's going to say other things about the student. So, and certainly there is a place in the application. You have 15 opportunities to write about your experiences. And so we encourage students to write about their hobbies and to write about experiences that aren't related to medicine, because it offers dimension. It sort of gives a full picture of who that student is, what's important to them, and how you write about these experiences, is important. A lot of people focus a lot of their energy and time on the personal statement, but the reality is that your application entries, your experience write-ups are just as important. How you write about those experiences, what aspects of those experiences are really valuable to you. Okay, I'll do a couple more questions. Should a reapplicant completely change the list of schools? No, they shouldn't. We have students who reapply to schools that they didn't get into the previous year, get accepted. You do not need to completely change your entire list of schools. I would recommend really doing an analysis of your school list, though, to figure out, does that list need to be changed? Because, is that part of the reason why the student wasn't successful on the initial application? So Pankaj asks, for UC schools, is there any data that says what percent of the class is filled by December or February, given its rolling admissions specific to UCLA? I don't know of any of that data. The only information I can tell you is that by the end of March, the school has to have extended at least the number of positions that they have seats in the class. So let's say they have 100 positions in the class, they have to have extended at least 100 acceptances. And depending on the school's, yield and, how many students that they accept actually matriculate, but that data is not released. Okay, one more comment. Oops, sorry. Okay, is it easier to get into college if you take more than one gap year, Salma asks. I assume you're talking about medical school when you say college. Again, depends on the student. We have students who apply at the end of their junior year, don't take any gap years, and they get into, top tier medical schools. There's really not a clear-cut answer. I would say it probably is, quote, easier to get in if you take a single gap year. I don't know that a second gap year is going to help you. But again, this depends on your individual situation. We're working with one student right now who did not do well as an undergraduate, did some postgraduate work, also got some additional work experiences, and is already accepted to more than one medical school. So, that's a student who had to take several gap years to make up for their undergraduate performance and has done very, very well in the process. So it really depends on the individual's background. There sort of isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. Okay. Naditya Tool asks, I'm thinking about doing a master's program. Is that okay to go for an online master's programs? Generally speaking, medical schools, certainly for undergraduate degrees, they don't accept online degrees. So I would say that you can do that, but I don't think it's going to be respected in the same way that a traditional in-person master's program is. It also depends on what the master's is in as well. But generally speaking, online classes are not going to be looked at the same way that in-person classes and programs are looked at. So I thank you all so much for being here tonight. There was a great range of questions, all terrific questions. I hope to see everybody back here next week. If you are not a part of our Facebook group, I encourage you to join our Facebook group, and you can post questions there. We are creating a very, a special community in our Facebook group. So I encourage you to join there. If you are applying to medical school in the future, and you're interested in working with us, please reach out to us, sign up for a free 15-minute consultation, and you can do that via our website. But I appreciate all the questions tonight, and you were a great audience, and I hope you all have a terrific weekend. Stay safe, and we will see you back here next week. Bye-bye.